yesterday, Derek and I hiked Arthur's Seat, which you guys maybe have seen. When you were making your introductory comments, I was remembering that sort of narrative that we had on the way down, and actually on the way up, I was commenting to Derek, in the U.S., there'd be handrails, right? There'd be signs, there'd be stairs and some rocks, right? There'd be an elevator. You'd have the option to just sit in a spherical screen and have a virtual experience of Arthur's Seat instead of actually climbing it. But so we're coming down, and there were these maybe German teenagers who, physically impossibly, were sort of walking down a rock face that was completely vertical. There's no way this could have been happening, right? And the girl who is sort of in the front of the group is carrying this giant can of beer, and they're all laughing, and the rocks are sort of tumbling down from under her feet, and she sort of says to the group of us who are on our way down something is it possible to get down? And clearly no, it's impossible. And so we're witnessing this, which I think for me and probably for you is at least a transgression of common sense, right? If not the rules that you don't see anything on a sign that said you can't do this. But luckily, the end of the story is that this non-finalist for the Nobel Prize did not continue, or did not go back, but she wound up somehow continuing down, walking down this thing, sort of wobbling down this rock face, and she made it. And she and her friends are laughing, right? They're pretty trashed, and they're just having a good time. But Derek and I, and I'm reduced to this sort of completely impotent senior citizen, right? And I'm saying, Derek, should we say something? But afterwards, we were talking about how it made us angry to see this happen, right? It kind of got us both a little bent out of shape to see what had gone on here. And in one respect, there was this urge to say something, right? That I was kind of caught up. Do I somehow impose here's what civilized people should be doing, right? And you should be watching out for yourself, and you should be thinking about this, and you should be thinking about the position that you're going to put us in, right? And there's this call to enforce something. And so I'm noticing, as I'm thinking about Christopher McCandless, I wonder if there's a similar call that we feel with him, right? There's a way in which he, in going to Alaska and sort of shuffling off the symbolic order, he's transgressing something that we're all sort of enlisted to enforce in a way. And early in the film, you see Chris McCandless in that bus that was just up there, pretending to drive it and pretending to have a bus full of people, and he's yelling at his imaginary passengers. And one of the things he says is, "Listen, old man, don't psychoanalyze me." But here we are, right, in the position of that old man doing something like psychoanalyzing. And we're trying to be very circumspect, and we should remember too that I think as Eric mentioned, that what we're responding to is not a person. Right? It's a collection of scraps of images and texts and representations, and recollections from people who did and didn't know him. And so Chris McCandless, who we're sort of approaching here, is also at the same time absent from our discourse. He exists here as a sort of metaphor. Yet what we're doing in whatever removed fashion is bringing to bear what he might have seen as an overbearing, all too civilized way of thinking about this guy's life, which he lost trying to get away from civilization. So I'm not sure what it means to do that as respectfully as possible, but I think it's maybe just sort of worth keeping in mind the question, what motivates us just like what would have motivated us to be angry with those rock climbers, what motivates us to chase down the memory of Chris McCandless and subject it to this inquiry that's firmly grounded in the symbolic order, or what he in the movie leeringly calls a society. We're sort of making ourselves representatives of this big other in relation to his memory. And Sean Penn seems to be aware of that same issue in the way that he makes the movie, in the way he's maybe thinking about watching and making the movie. The viewer, when you're watching it, you get sort of implicated as this watchful other. Sort of maybe not so much as a voyeur as like Foucault's idea of the panopticon, right? You're kind of like surveilling him. And that gets brought to your attention by the several moments where the McCandless character looks into the camera, just sort of out of nowhere, and kind of reminds us of our role watching him, even though he's sort of trying to get away. A friend of mine who I watched this with when that happened pointed out, like, he's still not alone enough. Right? Like, he's sitting on a park bench, or he's in a freight train going somewhere, right? And then he kind of looks at the camera to remind us that that big other has not quite left him. And like the police, who so frequently seem to be trailing him, we threaten to subject him to a law he doesn't want to recognize. Or like the satellites his father helped build, we watch him, we track him. And it's that relationship to father and to law that I'd like to look at more closely, making some use of Lacan's idea of the name of the father that Colin mentioned as a guide. I think we can confidently say that Christopher, as a character at least, has a pretty complex and problematic relationship, not just with his father the man, but with this name of the father, which is like a signifier that Lacan sees as the entry point into the symbolic order, the subjective sort of linchpin of the law, the instance that separates the psychotic from the neurotic subject. And so with Lacan, here's a quote from Lacan: "Let us now try to conceive of a circumstance of the subjective position in which what responds to the appeal to the name of the father is not the absence of the real father, but this absence is more compatible with the presence of the signifier, with the lack of the signifier itself." Before we do that, let's actually look at Chris's real father for a moment, who I think is relevant here. Just to remind you, Chris's father was an engineer who worked first for an aircraft company and then for NASA, and was involved in making satellites, airplanes and then satellites. We know from Careen's statements that the father, Walter McCandless, was a heavy drinker who abused his family viciously. And like Lacan, Walter actually had two families. He'd been previously married, and that second marriage to Chris's mother began in an affair with Chris's mother, obviously, who was his subordinate at this aircraft company. And it wasn't until Chris was 18 that he learned that his father had not divorced by the time Chris and Careen were born. In fact, Walter continued to have children with his first wife after Christopher was born. So for Careen and Christopher, this made Walter's marriage to their mother, as well as the legitimacy of his paternity, fraudulent. And it's worth noting that Christopher learned these facts while on a trip home from his home in Virginia to the West Coast to reconnect with friends and more distant family. That lends a new resonance to his quoting from Wallace Stegner, "Freedom from history," this is Chris's quote from Stegner, "freedom from history and obligation and law, absolute freedom. The road has always led west." And it was on the West Coast, perhaps, that Christopher was released from any obligation to buy into the law, as presented through his father, through the name of the father. And he returned to the West to push as far into that freedom from the social order as he could. In the film, Walter threatens to cancel Christmas. And Billy, the wife, angrily asks him, "Do you think you're God?" And Walter replies, "That's right, I am God." But according to Careen, that moment, that claim to the sort of ultimate name of the father wasn't uncommon for Walter. he would, during these drunken, abusive explosions, frequently identify himself as God. And that being the case, we have a way to track at least one form of the name of the Father over the course of the film. When we hear about God, we can imagine that at some level Chris's father is being evoked. And through that lens, the act of Christopher burning his money and his identification takes on a new valence. Everything that bore Chris's given name was completely destroyed, as was his money itself, being so important to his materialistic father, which he burned in the form of credit cards and the fortune he gave to charity and every physical bill that bore the slogan, "In God We Trust." During Christopher's time with those two maybe hippie rubber tramps, what were their names again?
Wayne Westerberg was
okay,
Bureau is Jan.
Okay, yeah. So when he was with them, the husband says to him, "You're not Jesus, are you? Are you going to walk across the water?" And besides providing a nice piece of foreshadowing about the unforgeable river at the end of the film that traps Chris in the Alaskan wilderness, that question points the way to another valence of God as the name of the Father for Christopher. If his Father is God, then might he be the Son of God? His parallels to the character of Jesus are actually numerous. Just as Jesus leaves the realm of divinity for human society, Christopher leaves his Father's kingdom, human society, for the wild, arguably dying to the world in order to be reborn. He attempts to compensate for his father's cruelty, apparently, by instating for himself what Corinne called a fiercely rigorous moral code, even as he rejected that of the society at large. And like Christ, Christopher's paternity is at issue. His mother was impregnated outside of marriage, while his father was married to someone else, which is sort of something that's impossible within the bounds of polite society, right? Like being on the grid. Just as Mary's impregnation by God is impossible. And of course, like Jesus, Chris McCandless spent some time in a cave at some point. So one would think that all of Christopher's references to God might be negative because of the overlap with his father, but that's not the case. There are times that God seems to show up in ways that are beneficent, but they generally seem to be when the signifier is mediated by a kinder father figure, another imaginary father figure, like with the husband, Rubber Tramp, and Ron, the older man, who tells Chris, "When you forgive, God's light shines on you." And that's an interesting moment. I don't know if you remember this in the film, because when he says that, and they're sitting on this overlook, and Chris, when Ron says that, becomes jubilant because the sun comes out from behind a cloud, like sort of literally making God's light shine on them. A celestial father, or S-U-N, son, occupying the same space as his father's airplanes and satellites, but more powerful, more primitive, occupying the place of the real, beyond the symbolic order that makes satellites and airplanes possible. He again evokes God in his parting words to the world: "I've had a happy life, and thank the Lord. Goodbye, and may God bless all." I want to be careful about how we characterize Christopher's use of the signifier God and keep it an open question whether that's simply an appeal to a primordial father, like as in an element of the real, or whether it's in fact still a wholly symbolic move that indicates that Christopher did in fact retain his place in the symbolic order, tied to the name of the Father, but separate from his actual Father. And I'll come back to that. It may also be worth noting the way the word king shows up in McCandless's discourse, specifically his installation of Jack London as, in all caps, king. Derek quoted this. Maybe as a gesture of regicide, a replacement for his own father, with one whose creation, Buck, the dog, Christopher so strongly identified with. His use of the phrase "into the wild" is clearly a reference to Jack London's Call of the Wild, and his choice of Alaska seems to be an identification with Buck the dog, who himself goes from domesticity to primal wildness, his own sort of paternity as a leader of other wild animals in Alaska, if you're familiar with that novel. I want to talk a bit about the proper name, too. So, again, Derek mentioned this moment where Christopher is in the bathroom in this gas station or something in Arizona, and looks at himself and declares, I need a name. And he writes Alexander Supertramp in lipstick on the mirror. So what about the name he left behind before he writes that in lipstick? I want to preface by saying that from a Lacanian point of view, it's not necessary for us to be conscious of the historical meanings and reverberations of our names in order for them to affect us. So we live in what we could fancily call a synchronic and diachronic network of signifiers, the symbolic order. And we can even be conceived of in our behavior and our experience as effects of or subjects of language. Echoes of language, of signifiers, reverberate down through generations in profound and even if mutable ways to impact our psychic lives. And I'm telling you that because I know how ridiculous what I'm about to say is. So as we've already noticed, the first syllable of Christopher's first name is, goes pretty well with his father's identification as God. And at some level, it places Christopher firmly within his father's impossible fantasy, a supporting role in God's story, and indeed one whose destiny is to be sacrificed and reborn. But what about the last name? And this is just something to kind of toss around, McCandless. And this is great that we're here, McCandless. It's because it's actually a name that I guess showed up first not far from here in Galloway. Anybody been to Galloway? Does Galloway exist? Is it a real place? Yeah. Okay. So that's where that name, I guess, first gets documented, McCandless, which I guess at the time, because of the way the political structures here worked, that Galloway was sort of a no man's land when that name showed up, like Alaska. And the McCandless family crest eventually bore the motto Sola Nobilitas Virtus, which means virtue is the only nobility, which is really striking, like how well that motto seems to describe Christopher's own worldview. Virtue is the only nobility, the willingness to leave behind any claim to a sort of heritable nobility and seek one's bona fides only on the basis of one's own virtue. Remember, again, Chris Careen says, measured himself by a fiercely rigorous moral code. He became radically ascetic, radically ethical in a sense, and so radically that it cost him his place in society. I don't know if anybody here is into etymology from this region, but the name McCandless, I guess, what I came up with when I was researching this is that the word candless is most likely derived from kundlias, which seems to mean hound, which perhaps casts a new light on Chris's fascination with and coronation of Jack London and his identification, his radical identification with the character of a dog. But here we encounter something puzzling. McCandless gives up his name and his place in the symbolic maybe, and turns radically away from the name of the father. So how is it that precisely the ways in which he did this still seem so weirdly determined by that very name? He becomes a dog like Buck, a real kundlias, howling in the Alaskan wilderness just after he realizes that there are no other humans around. It's as though he's actually taking up the name of the father even more radically. But we might say that even as he uses the signifier of the name of the father, Christopher moves past it in a way that many of us can't, and is attempting to access what Lacan calls the primordial father. And it's this radicality, this primordiality that interests me. There seems to be a move away from the usual place of the name of the father, and perhaps language in general, the symbolic order, into the realms of the imaginary and the real. I recently saw Trevor Noah, who's a South African comedian, who presents us pretty nicely with the way the symbolic can come to function with its own power over the real, without constant recourse to the real. He talks about coming to the U.S. and walking through New York City with an American friend of his, and crossing streets, right, at intersections. And if you've been to New York, like the traffic sort of can be terrifying, right? And there are these big trucks barreling up the streets, and he comes to the intersection, and coming from where he comes from, and the way that traffic lights work, I guess, in South Africa, and you can speak to that, like, he's not going to trust that that truck is going to stop, right? So he stops short, but his friend just sort of boldly walks into the intersection, and the truck is freaking out about it, and the friend says, "Oh no, it's fine, I've got the light." Right? So Noah, in a way, we can say, is like expressing his astonishment at the power of the symbolic to overwrite the real. South Africa's symbolic relationship to traffic lights is not non-existent, but it's different. Right? And the truck is the thing there, right? The reality of the truck that's going to barrel over you. So maybe we can think about Chris's relationship to the name of the Father as more like focusing on the truck than it is on the light. The signifier is sort of not powerful enough, maybe, or maybe it's too powerful, I'm not sure. Lacan says about the name of the Father in a certain place, mythically, the Father can only be an animal. The primordial Father is the Father from before the incest happened, before the appearance of the one, of the structures of marriage and kinship, in a word of culture. In other words, the name of the Father is exactly the mechanism by which the neurotic subject is overwritten by the law, by culture. But that doesn't always succeed. The father, or whoever carries this paternal function, kind of has to play by the rules of the law, must be bound by it. But the place where you get the name of the Father instated has to sort of be like subject to the law. It can't be above it, as we're finding out in my country right now. So you can't, for example, beat your family viciously while proclaiming to be God and have the power to annihilate the most important holiday in Western culture. But Walter McCandless, positioning himself as the creator rather than the subject of the law, perhaps fails to instate the name of the Father in the place of the symbolic. So if we want to think about it that way, we could say maybe that's sort of what enables Chris McCandless to push past the name of the Father as a signifier into a much more primordial state of affairs. I'm going to read you a sort of lengthy Lacan quote. It's the lack of the name of the Father in that place, which by the hole that it opens up in the signified sets off a cascade of reworkings of the signifier from which the growing disaster of the imaginary proceeds until the level is reached at which the signifier and signified stabilize in a delusional metaphor. But how can the name of the Father be summoned by the subject to the only place from which it could have come into being for him, and in which it has never been, by nothing other than a real Father, not at all necessarily by the subject's own Father, but by a one Father? And it's perhaps that real Father that we see in the wolf or dog that Christopher wants to become, or in the role of the Son with a U and God, or the wilderness at play for him. In one telling scene, he sits with, I already talked about that. So that moment when the sun comes out with Ram, you have a sort of move toward that primordial Father again in the sort of realness of the sun itself. This failed summoning of language, quote, to the only place from which it could have come into being, which it has never been, into the symbolic order, that is, in such a way that it overwrites or drains away the real, might be seen too in the way Christopher writes. I don't mean his writing style, I mean the way he writes. The way it shows up in the film, anyway, the process of writing for him, which keeps appearing, is better described as like inscription. Rather than using pen and paper, what Christopher tends to do is to put words on things or carve them into things. He changes the properties of solid objects with words. It's not enough to write. The mirror, the beach, a slab of wood, a leather belt. He uses signifiers to literally chip away at the real, or if you will, at the wild. For the neurotic, the signifier is powerful on its own terms, within the symbolic order, like the traffic light. The other is language, is already powerful without looking for the truck. For Christopher, it's like the power of the signifier maybe desperately is brought to bear against the over-presence, the too-muchness of the world itself via a combination of the imaginary and the real. It's akin to trying to make a big stoplight that will physically obstruct the truck. It's this that the lack of the name of the Father at a symbolic level perhaps makes necessary. And then just a couple of comments about the law. The name of the Father for Lacan is always tied to the notion of the law, and again, not in content, but in structure. And he refers to the symbolic Father, Lacan does, as the author of the law for the subject. And the idea that the signifier of the Father ties the subject to the law is more or less interchangeable with the idea that it ties him to the symbolic. It moves the subject away from the realm of the imaginary and the real. It rules him. But again, the law can't simply be a persecutory force in order to be instated. If Walter represented the law, he did so in a way that was quite persecutory. And like the proper name, the law is something that haunts McCandless throughout the film. It's the law as threat, as violence, as surveillance. It stalks him in the form of distant sirens, in the form of the river patrol coming after him for boating without a permit, threatening his radical freedom. It's in the form of the policeman who pulls him from his romantic solitary ride on his freight train, beating him and using a dog of all things to overpower him. And you have to remember that Chris's stated intention after college was to go to Harvard Law, a plan that met with his parents' approval. Clinically, sometimes we see students or in law school or lawyers who are actually drawn to that profession as a means to sort of compensate for a psychotic structure, for the absence of the law in their own experience. But that's another topic. One wonders about Walter's relationship to the law. Certainly during his rages, he saw himself as the ultimate author of it, God, which is a position at the same time outside the law, and yet he seems in the film obsessed with it, the father does, castigating Corinne, for example, for wanting to drive while they're visiting Christopher for graduation because it's against the law for you to drive in another state. This isn't an impartial appeal to rules, it's a form of emotional brutality, a punishment for her excitement over being with her brother. And it's precisely Chris's father's obsession with the law, and by extension, society's relationship with it, that Chris rejects by not pursuing his position at Harvard and fleeing into the wild. We might note that as far as it's related to his father's version of the law, Christopher's rejection is the rejection of a psychotic version of the law. And that reintroduces the possibility that, maybe what he's doing is actually moving toward the symbolic. But it's such a profound rejection, and one which spreads to the law even of the symbolic order, that it seems to constitute like a passage à l'acte, right? It's sort of like moving beyond symbolizing things and into a sort of level of like really enacting them. I'm noticing too that I haven't said anything about Christopher's mother, and the film says very little about her. We know that she was unable to disentangle herself from Walter, despite her repeated promises to her children that they would leave him. And it seems to me that the better chance for Christopher to have had a name of the father, a symbolic instance, may have lain with his mother. But it seems like she made herself Walt's subject from very early on, as his subordinate at work, and then as his mistress, and then as his captive and his wife. So I'm sure there's more to say there. And I just want to return to the anomaly that Derek mentioned. This, at the end of the story, where Chris gets is he wanted to go back. He wanted to return to society. And we can't know everything about what that means, certainly in real life, but I think that we have to remain really open to the idea that he may have access and ability to desire a place in society in a new way. And related to that, and more importantly for our discussion, he reclaims his proper name. He's no longer Alexander Supertramp in his last communication to the world. He signs that note, Christopher Johnson McCandless. So I wonder about what it was that allowed that shift. Was it just a simple imaginary loneliness, a grudging acknowledgement that this was the only way that he would be identified after he died? And why would he want to be identified? Why would he want to be named? Or was it a process whereby he could somehow claim and reinstate the name of the father? Or is it just the case that he was never truly free of it? The world will never know. That's about all.